So let's get right into it. We start with note names. Now, note names, well, it's not a perfect system. It works really well with the current Western music theory system, and if trying to change and making better would probably break everything. So I think I have to give it an S tier. Triads, beautiful, very simple, way better than like any chordal harmony, probably better than our note names, but they go together really well. So I think triads has to be S tier. Seventh chords, I think a little bit worse or maybe even better. It's really hard to compare these two, and I will probably put them interchangeably. Some seventh chords are better than others, but I'm just gonna put it like there. Upper chord extensions, I'm gonna give that a high A tier. Some of them work better than other, but sometimes they can be a little harder to use. It require a little bit more expertise. Inversions, okay, I think I'm gonna have to give inversions lower than upper chord. Actually, I think a higher, because they can really help your harmony be way smoother. So let's change this order. Nice. Intervals, I think I gotta give intervals an S tier. I think I'll put it above. I think I'll put below note names, because sometimes it can be pretty confusing. For example, you say, oh, Phrygian dominant has an augmented second, return a minor third, and that can just be a little, just, I don't know, weird and messy. Major scales, I gotta give it the S tier. I mean, it's just classic. Our entire Western music theory is kind of built around this baby. Modes, when it comes down to modes, I think I have to give it a high A tier. Some of the modes are a little harder and don't really make sense, including Locrian. Well, just mainly Locrian. But if you really get good at them, you can create some pretty cool sounds. Minor scales, I think I'm going to put that below major scales, mainly because major is easier to work with, but minor can really cover a lot of motion, but so can major. So it's really hard to compare these two. When it comes down to pentatonic scales, I'll give it a low A tier. While it is quite easy to write some melodies with it, it lacks the full part of a major scale or a minor scale, and normally your harmony will just be using that, so it's kind of weird, not that good by itself. Exotic scales or alto scales, I'll give it a high B tier. They have their own sound, and alto scales work really well in jazz, and exotic scales can work in other cultures, but like in pop music and just even R&B and that stuff, sometimes it's really risky to go for that sound. So I'm gonna give it still a high B tier for what it brings to the table, other than these classic major minor scales. Key signatures, I gotta give that S tier. Let's go put it underneath triads. I'll put it in between seventh chords. Very intuitive with a circle fifth. I love that stuff. Transposition. Okay, I'm gonna have to give transposition low B tier. Now, it does make sense to have transposing instruments. For example, all saxophones have the same fingerings, but the sound coming out of it isn't the same. But that does make it a little better if you're a sax player, so you can go from tenor and alto, and you can play the same fingerings. That saying, things can get a little bit more confusing when trying to figure out what chord is being played when you have a tenor sax, a horn in F, clarinet, an E flat, clarinet. It can be so confusing. When it comes to Roman numerals, I gotta give it a low A tier. Roman numerals are pretty great, but the consistency can be a little weird. For example, should you say the 3 in minor, the 3/4 minor should be a flat 3 or 3? That is something that most people would say flat 3, but this little confusion I think gives it a lower A. But extremely useful, especially since they transpose. I think I should put it above pentatonic scales at least, and maybe above upper chord extensions. Now, dynamics, I think I gotta give it a low S tier, mainly because dynamics don't really mean anything unless you know the conductor and what the conductor actually wants you to play. Because the forte in certain songs won't be the same. For example, my band director once said, hey, this composer, when he writes mezzo forte, he means get out of the way, but still be there. So yeah, that's why I'm giving it a low S tier. In theory, it can work pretty well, but sometimes it's not as good. Okay, now we go into note values. I think I'll just give note values A tier, pretty neutral on that thing. And now we have clefs. Bass clef, treble clef, they work pretty well. Now, I think it would probably make sense to only have one clef, just the treble clef or the bass clef and make it just go up an octave. But I guess they do serve some purpose, so I'm going to give it a middle A tier above pentatonic scales. Articulation, very important. Gotta give it the S tier. Really important in creating the uniqueness of a sound. Let's put it above note names, below semichords. Time signatures, 4/4/3/4. It all makes sense. I feel like it really does the job well. Time signatures can get a little controversial, like in determining the time signature of the song, but honestly that shouldn't matter. I'll put it above intervals because they're really solid, and above note names, and above articulation. Let's do that. So yeah, those are our time signatures. Now, tuplets. Oh my god, I can't remember. Are tuplets just like... I think the only tuplet I would ever use would be a 3, would be triplets, or to specify that we're putting straight eighth notes in a swing piece. I'll still give it a high B tier, but when we get to pentuplets and septuplets, it can kind of get a little crazy. Okay, rhythm / interpretation / solfege. I think it still is pretty important, especially rhythm interpretation. So I'm going to give it an A tier. I'm not completely familiar with that, so don't judge me on that too hard. Cadences and functional harmony. I gotta give that S tier. Especially, it's super helpful when you're a beginner songwriter, and it's not that hard at all. It's used all over Western music theory. Put it over dynamics, intervals. Below time signatures, I'm gonna be safe with that one. Polyrhythms, I'll give it a middle B tier. I'll put it over exotic scales. They can be a little bit more interesting to use, especially a 3/2. I don't know all my polyrhythms and how good they are. And now we got to tritone substitution, and I gotta give that a low A tier, especially because it has its sound and it works really well in jazz, but don't use it everywhere. Microtonality, I gotta give that D tier. Just don't do it. Now, it's pretty cool when Jacob Collier does it in some bands, but I mean, just don't do it. It's just really weird. Harmonic series, I gotta give that B tier. I mean, actually, I'll give it an A tier, a low A tier, above tritone substitution, because it's used when creating our instruments. Without knowing about the harmonic series, it'd be a lot harder. Now, the harmonic series, unfortunately, does not work with 12-tone equal temperament, which can kind of suck. But whatever, we gotta deal with that. 12 temperaments, I'll give it a D tier, above microtonality. I mean, sometimes people care a little bit too much about your temperament. Just do 12 tet, you should be fine. Last but not least, ear training, and I'll put that above harmonic series and that stuff, because I think ear training is really important in becoming a better musician and player in general. And this is my music theory tier list. Pretty subjective, but whatever, just my opinion.